people are starting to come in now. I think we'll get started. Be respectful of everybody's time. So I'm Dean Evans. I moderate the now the Multifamily Housing Innovation Network program. It used to be the peer-to-peer network, and we haven't done a real heavy revamp, but we've done some stuff to try and bring people who've been in the network for a while up to speed on what we've been doing. And we have an extremely robust web presence of the archive versions of these talks that we've done in the past. And we're encouraging all our members who can't come to one or haven't come to one to check them out. We're trying to do a little bit more with that resource. And so we're trying to promote it a little bit more, which is good. And this presentation will be the next addition to the archive. And we meet roughly once a month, maybe 9 to 10 times a year for presentations like this, and then discussion amongst the members in terms of how they can. It's an interesting network. It's developers, architects, designers, engineers, energy consultants, policy people who were involved in affordable multifamily generally, but affordable more particularly in Connecticut, Massachusetts. So the way we'll run this is everybody will mute while you guys are talking about the project and showing the project. And then once you're done, we'll open up to questions. If there's really a pressing question, I ask the people on the participant list to raise their hands, and I will interrupt you guys or put it in the chat, and I will interrupt you guys and see if we can answer. Otherwise, when we get to the actual Q&A at the end, it'll be a fairly robust free-for-all amongst all the participants. So there's really no order or rigor to it, other than people can raise their hands if they want to, or put stuff in the chat. So with that, I'll turn to, I don't know who wants to talk first, Gretchen, Jason, or Jose. Gretchen?
No, I think Jason's going to kick it off.
Oh, Jason. Okay, Jason,
Yeah,
kick off.
I'll kick us off.
Maybe you can introduce yourselves,
Yep.
and then for everybody who's on, I think you all know we're going to be talking about this extremely interesting new project at the Yale Divinity School called the Living Village, and where that stands now, with how it was birthed, all that other good stuff. So with that, Jason, I'll turn it over to you and mute myself.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'll just start with a brief introduction of myself. My name is Jason Jewhurst. I'm a principal and partner at Bruner, Cott Architects. We're the lead architect for the Living Village that we're going to talk about today. We're also a firm that has focused on affordable and multifamily housing design and sustainability over several decades. So it's exciting to be able to talk about this project in that context with all of you. I'm joined here with my colleague, Gretchen Neeley. She's a senior associate at Bruner Cott Architects, working side by side with me. Actually, she's on the site almost every other day, thinking about this project. And I want to also introduce Jose Alminana from Andropogon Associates. He's our lead landscape architect. They're out of Philadelphia. And we've had the benefit of working together for almost 10 years on this, Jose, if I think about it. Thinking about this project and being in construction now, it really is a meaningful process. So without any further ado, we'll get started. I'll share my screen. We're going to show you, this is a reprisal of a presentation that we had pulled together for a couple of conferences. So just bear with me while I share my screen here. And can everybody see, it will take a village, a transformative path slide. Just.
Yep, it's
Excellent.
there.
So we went through our introductions, but I will say, thinking about affordable housing and multifamily housing in New England and the region, it's one of the more critical areas of work that we're focusing on right now. And the Living Village is a really interesting overlay and a lot of synergies between multi-generational housing, affordable housing, and then also mixed and market rate and urban context. So we do work in a wide range of a lot of built infrastructure that's already in place, and thinking about how housing can be sustainable and being developed in neighboring communities on the hub line, on mass transit, close to urban centers, so that we can continue to build out our city centers in a more equitable way, providing more and more housing. We introduced ourselves, but we have a wonderful team that supports us as well. So there's probably over 75 to 100 professionals that have worked on this project and contributed to it. So we like to start with, we're working through the Yale Divinity School. but there's a large, a structure and a layer of who else is involved from the campus. So that's a really hefty team of support, but also working in an existing context is really important when we're thinking about projects of this scale. On our side of the table, we have a whole host of, whether it's material, health strategy consultants, water system consulting, all the way down to soils engineering and thinking about hydrology. So Jose will touch on some of these themes, but teams today, we see it requires a consortium of thoughtful, creative professionals to help these projects come through the process and also make them the best that they can be. So wonderful way for us to be able to work, and so fortunate to have so many wonderful, talented folks. We're also connected through this project to the International Living Future Institute. The Institute manages the Living Building Challenge building standard. We'll talk a little bit about that. This project from the very beginning, the Living Village, had targeted a regenerative design strategy that would be Living Building certified. So thinking through systems in a holistic way, we'll talk about that as we go through this. I'll also say that we had a lot of fun, even though we were working through the pandemic, like many of us on the phone over the years. This design process kicked up in 2021. So we really kicked up the design process, and these were the first meetings we had in over a year that we were able to come together and think collectively about where we wanted the project to be. And that was, rewarding. And like many of you, I'm sure having that connection to large teams and working with the community. So as we worked with the professionals on our side, we are also getting reflections and ideas from our clients. So really having an input that creates a shared authorship on projects like this. And we do think that that is such a critical part of our work, and having a true collaborative relationship with our team as well as the community we're designing for. And that's kind of how we think about it. We're only there for a very short period of time. The people living in these buildings will be there for decades to come. So just real quickly, the vision for the Living Village. The dean had a vision for over 12 years ago, thinking about how can we have our students who come through the Divinity School, how can they start to live like global citizens? How can they have a better relationship with the environment? And most importantly, how can we build community through architecture and landscape to foster these ideas and these conversations about how we live with the climate change that we're seeing? How do we begin to adapt? And then how do we develop behaviors that are more attuned and more connected to our surroundings? And that boiled down into 4 goals. So it really is a training ground. They see the Living Village as a training ground for builders of communities that will go out into the world. Their students are generally going out into the world and helping people, making it an affordable place to live. Now, this is a graduate school at Yale where tuition is paid, but the goal for this is that the students that go to Divinity, if they show need, that they can go, the goal is for them to go to school for almost free and $0 while they're staying on campus. It's clear that most students that graduate from Divinity, they're not going into lucrative, high-paying or high net worth positions. They're going out in service of other communities. And this is a way to sort of make it more equitable in a place like Yale for students to come get an education and become part of that community, but not be burdened with the debt that so many students are seeing today. And then the last 2, demonstrating ecological stewardship and tying that to a word that we do talk about in other presentations, but there's a connection to ecological stewardship and theology that's really important theme at Divinity today. And they call it's basically blending those ideas and philosophies into there's this theological ecological connection, that it's eco-theology, that there's actually a course of study that they talk about how to live more harmonious with the land, and also have this connection to other philosophies. And then we know that this building was built at a time that it was not built to be outward and welcoming to everybody. It was more introspective and cloistered and closed. And the idea and the design for the both landscape and the building, we're going to talk about this, is that in every way possible, it should be welcoming and inviting and setting a new course for them in the future. Just to give ourselves some context, if you've been to Yale Divinity School, then you know where it is. But if you haven't, it's up on the hill. It's a little bit separate from the main campus of Yale, and it's actually in the center of New Haven. But you'll see that it's a 15-acre site that has many historic buildings on it. And what we're building on currently is we're looking at knitting together the landscape, removing this large parking lot, and connecting to existing buildings, and thinking about how that can work as one consortium of space. So a little bit about the Living Building Challenge. You know, the Living Building Challenge, if you're familiar with the LEED certification process, if you look at green enterprise communities standards, if you're looking at or read about WELL, what the Living Building Challenge does is it challenges the group, and it also starts to think about, okay, so as you think about LEED, as you think about sustainability, as you think about net zero, how can your project also begin to heal and regenerate and restore the surroundings, the environment, and the communities that they serve? So starting to think about pollution-free goals, thinking about how not only creating enough energy to operate the building for 1 year as it moves in balance, but maybe generating a little bit more to give back. So thinking about how buildings can be self-sufficient, how they can be more resilient, and how they can promote health and well-being through the materials that they're built with. So taking that step and thinking about what this project can offer beyond just minimizing its damage to the environment, but what can it do over time to heal that? On Yale's campus and in many cities, there are buildings that have been following the LEED process and going through LEED certification and pushing that elevation of sustainability and thinking about how buildings operate and use energy. You know, Yale's been thinking about that too through their standard. Croon Hall was built about 15 to 20 years ago. That was LEED Platinum. That set their course for the next stage. And really the Living Village is on the other side of net zero design. It's thinking about restoring and creating a net positive outcome. The Living Building Challenge framework is the way, you know, in a way that it's the first philosophy, advocacy, and building standard that brings together both halves of, I think, the mind and the brain, where it really focuses on the technical side in a holistic way of thinking about energy, water, materials, but it also starts to examine health and happiness. What does it mean for a place? What does it mean for a building and architecture and landscape to grow from its place? Thinking about design and beauty as one, as sustainability, as thinking through this holistic lens. And then we're going to talk about equity in the materials as well. So thinking about how the buildings are actually built from buildings that are not, and they buildings that are not toxic. So thinking about a historic campus, expanding on a campus that's already built. It was built in the 1920s. It was recently renovated over the years, but ultimately you have an historic campus that needs housing closer to the academic building. So there is housing existing that was built in the 50s. And that's up on the corner on the top of the slide. And then the yellow is where the new Living Village is going to be sited and is currently under construction. So we're connecting the history and the architecture so that they're in conversation with each other. Just to give you a context, if you haven't been here, it's quite beautiful. If you're in New Haven, you should definitely walk through. All these spaces are public. These are the existing photographs from before construction. And then just shifting really quickly, you know, the vision was to bring a contemporary architecture that is at the highest level of sustainability and construction, but then having it be in conversation with the historic Federalist style, more modest buildings that are sort of sloping along this crest of the site. And this is the highest points. We're at the top of the watershed, which will be an important note as Jose talks through some of the site conditions. And with that, I'll hand you over to Jose.
Thank you, Jason, and good morning, everybody. So I think that, you know, fundamentally, the project stems from this idea that is a place-based design that is about this particular location and nowhere else. And as such, you know, I think that when we look at our position of a project in the landscape, and particularly in the watershed, each project has its own responsibility. So this happens to be located, if you go to the next slide, which is a bit more elaborate than the slides that we saw before, Jason. This first and foremost begins to actually knit the project with the rest of the elements that form this community in this part of New Haven. So there's the intention of connecting with some existing trails, to taking advantage of certain institutions that are nearby, botanical gardens, farms and so forth and so on, and make sure that this is outward, looking, as opposed to inward looking, as Jason was making before. So we wanted to create something that was very permeable. Now, being located in this particular part of the campus and regionally, we are at the top of a ridge line. The SDQ, the Sterling Quadrangle, is actually drapes over the center, in the middle of a ridge line. So the building, in that regard, if you go to the next slide, please, is located, right at the top of a watershed. So what it does, and imagine that axis north-south that you see here right now. So water is going to fall to the east and to the west, so it's the highest place in the watershed. And I think that water becomes such an important element that begins to organize and respond to that responsibility that it has. Next slide, please. So of importance is to think about, how this program is deployed on the site, so actually provides the greatest amount of accessibility and permeability and porosity. So the village is actually integrated in the site as a whole. It's not secluded from it by its own architecture. The architecture is very porous. You'll see that occurs on the ground plane and throughout the building. And then clicking through this, you can see where the entrance courtyard is, where there's a community courtyard, where all the buildings look into it, is connected directly with the Sterling Divinity Quadrangle entrance. And then it has a series of elements, for people to occupy the site and take advantage of it. There's places to grow food. There's places to eat food. There's places to gather around food. There's a place that we call the water commons, where the water is processed so it could be reused. There's an amphitheater that takes advantage of the morning light and has the most spectacular views of the East Rock in the distance. And then there is elements incorporated on that actually echo some of the old landscape components that this park-like area used to have. Next, please. So with that in mind, I think that we think about, the campus connections that this plan, enables, the connection to the deanery, the connection to the slope down to St. Ronan's, the connection to the courtyards inside of the building, inside of the quadrangle, and so forth and so on. But it's, as you can see, very porous. In the next slide, you will see a diagram that describes the entry points of the village and how do you move through it. And how do you move through it in a way that has to be 100% accessible and universally accessible? Next one, please. So when you look at the next slide, it is a rendering of the approach, the fundamental pedestrian approach to the building. And in this one here, you go back to that one. You can see the intention of actually moving through the landscape. Everything that you see in this slide in yellow, it's a fully accessible route for anybody with any disability can actually come here. There's a few places highlighted in red where we have steps, because after all, we're negotiating a change in grade upwards of 25 feet from the top of the ridge line to each edge of the campus. Next, please. So you can see how the building is, located on the side with the ridge line, with gravity working for us on either side, the relationship to the entrance to the Sterling Divinity Quadrangle. And the next slide, then tells a story about how, how do we going to deal with water? Because one of the imperatives of the Living Building Challenge is that we're net positive. We want to live out of the water that is available to us on the site. So here we can use gravity, which is free, to actually move water to the places where that water as a resource can actually be utilized. And by the way, there's only one water, and we'll go into that in a minute. Next, please. So the idea is that because we have to generate, we need to host a program here, the areas that need to be by definition impervious, i.e. the building roofs, is where we can collect the water from the sky and then direct that water to a series of cisterns where we can actually manage it and use it and reuse it on the site. So next slide, please. You will see how that water is actually directed from that high point through a series of landscape elements would actually, purify that water and actually manage what at the end of the day is a 100-year storm on site. And that's done through a series of interventions that have to do with materiality, with alignment of the paths, and all that circulation that you have that is accessible. It actually flows that movement of water. So you are in contact with this aspect of the functionality and the living systems of the site as you navigate through it. Now, on the water question, and the next slide is a little bit complicated. We'll try to make it simple. Is that this diagram here, this spaghetti diagram, is actually describing how the water that falls on the site is actually managed. So the next slide will show you how where the water comes from, and it comes basically from three sources: either collected by the roof of the building, as I mentioned before, falls on the site from the sky, or is actually supplied from the municipal sources from the city of New Haven. That water actually is used in a series of different ways. In the next slide, you will see how that potable water is utilized for becomes wastewater as being used through laboratories and washing machines and it becomes part of the wastewater system. That wastewater is then treated and collected and then reused for toilet flushing, or is used for drip irrigation on the site. And the rainwater, which is the cleanest water that we have, we're actually going to take it to actually be able to irrigate our site in areas where we're going to be in contact with people. So we want to take the water from the roof of the building, put it in a cistern, and actually use it for spray irrigation of the site in areas where we want to actually grow food or need to maintain turf areas. And then lastly, in green, we reconnect that water cycle and put that water back into the groundwater system, right? Or evapotranspirate it, and then the water, completes its cycle. And remember, there's only one water coming here. There's no water coming from anywhere else. It all comes from the sky, and it all goes back to the sky, or becomes part of the groundwater system, which we pump it out and then make it part of the hydrologic cycle again. So next, please. How that engages in the building is rather elegant and simple here. The water is collected by the roofs, goes through a series of vessels and a series of pieces of equipment that actually treat it and manage it. Next, please. Then it goes down towards what we call the water commons, which is where the water is actually collected for reuse, but actually the wastewater is actually circulated through a series of constructed wetlands where solar aquatics actually, and the life that exists in the root system of these plants actually takes that waste, quote unquote, human waste, because it's not natural waste, that we actually becomes food for the plants, and then the water is clean through photosynthesis in living systems. And then that water is then utilized again for irrigation of the landscape at subsurface levels, or is used for toilet flushing, because that's the way we move waste in our sanitary systems to date. And next, please. Here is the eastern slope, as I mentioned before, is the one that affords these spectacular views, but it's also where people can get in touch very directly with the way the water is managed. And this is completely integrated into the landscape features that you would see in the next slide, where we have, boardwalks that go over vegetated swells that manage rainwater, or you see decks and then constructed wetlands that actually are managing the wastewater. And it's all the same water, it's all integrated into place, and it's all experience for everybody because it's completely accessible for people to understand. Jason?
Yeah, and so similarly, just quickly a review of how energy moves through the project. So this we call it the U shape or horseshoe shape, building shape. We were met with this contemporary balancing contemporary new architecture that needs to generate electricity and power through renewable sources, but then also thinking about the context of the buildings that are on site already. So thinking about these gable roofs, and one of the elements that we wanted to bring forward in this design was to have the building shift its focus to what it is intended. So the roof is intended to provide shelter from the elements. It's collecting our water, as Jose just walked us through the life cycle of water as it falls on the site. And it also is to generate power. So what we were able to do was shift as the building wrapped around its each side. And many of you probably know this, but I'll just say it for just when we talk about energy being generated, we look at all roof surfaces in New England. So when you have a gable that faces east, west, or even south, those are all energy generating surfaces in the Northeast. So the way the azimuth of the sun, the way it moves through the site. So we have the benefit of having the sun move along the south axis, which opens up the roof and the architecture to capture 100%. So every surface of this roof, when we shift to that large shed roof that's not visible to the outside the site, that's the entire south-facing roof surface. We are collecting other energy from another ground array that's going to go over a much smaller parking lot down to the east of the site. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're generating about almost 60% of our power on east-facing and west-facing roofs. The other 42%, it's much more efficient and higher output is being collected on a south-facing roof. So just thinking about how the architecture tells the story and supports regenerative thinking, this enabled us to create a project that would be able to have architecture to reflect and follow the sun, almost like a flower, or almost like you're thinking about how your garden moves over the day. This is doing the same thing. And with that, I'll hand it over to Gretchen.
Yep. So thanks. Jose and Jason have both talked a lot about the kind of technical and the infrastructure that is a big part of this project. And it's what LBC, the Living Building Challenge, asks us to do. But the other petals I'm going to talk about are equally important. And that's kind of what I really like about LBC versus, say, LEED programs, is that it takes things like equity as an equal petal. And so that is really about making community. How in this project, and that's why, this is a dormitory or grad living housing, but I think it's pretty applicable to, co-housing models or multi-generational models of making community. And so, as Jason said, we did work with the context of a courtyard that's kind of all throughout the Yale campus, and particularly the Divinity School, the kind of Jeffersonian model that they have for their existing building. So we took that context, but we opened it up as much as possible. So there's a very large portal entry that invites the neighborhood into the courtyard, and then a second portal that then brings the landscape and the views in to that central courtyard. Next slide. So that was just context of some of the gateways, on the Yale campus, much smaller, but you do get glimpses in. Next slide. And this is the kind of image of the courtyard once you've gone through the courtyard, through the portal. You know, we imagine lots of different kinds of activities that can happen in this space to foster community. Next slide. So part of thinking about this project and thinking about programming was really important. We knew, right, that this would be a dormitory for housing, a living space. So there certainly needed to be particular square feet for bedrooms and kitchens and bathrooms, and that's a given. But one of the things was that the living space, and then as Jose has talked about the landscape, it was all about making community. And so really our program was more than just the kind of basic square foot needs, but it was things like chance encounters. How do you make community? I think one of the biggest things you'll see is that we have a lot of kitchens in this project because it's about sharing meals together. Certainly the issue of biophilia is a part of the LBC and thinking about beauty and nature and kind of equity. So this list of items was really in a way the kind of foundation of the way we were thinking about programming when we went through this project. Next slide. So one of the things that we did, and this doesn't happen in the Northeast much at all. It is a more southern type of layout, but we did use the single loaded corridor. And so that kind of for us really worked to foster community and talked about issues of equity so that the courtyard was open to everyone, that you didn't just have, well, I'm on the courtyard side or I'm on the back side. So everybody has a kind of view in their single rooms looking out, and then everybody gets to share the courtyard. Next slide. So you can kind of see what that does, right? That the corridor spaces widen a little bit with that kind of skewing so that we could then furnish it with some social spaces, but then everyone participates in the kind of community space in an equal manner. And so that's the rendering we did early on of that kind of living, the corridor space where you can look down. One thing is that's essentially a curtain wall. We didn't want everybody to get too much solar glare, so there's a kind of, we worked to have a series of louvers, which help to, in the winter months, bring the sun into that corridor, and in the summer months kind of, dampen a bit the solar glare that comes into that corridor. Next slide. One of the things that we thought about, right, with these chance encounters are issues of the fire stairs, for instance. So we tried to use warm materials. We have natural light that comes into the fire stairs so that there again is a kind of sense of place and space. The other thing you can see in this diagram to the right are some of the kind of types of the yellow is representing the more social spaces. Besides just the individual units, we do have a couple of additional study rooms, a couple of additional kind of community kitchens, and those are at the corners within the building that kind of lets that social corridor end in the corners. Next slide. And this is one of the rooms, one of the social rooms. This one actually is over that front kind of portal entrance. Next slide. This is one of the community kitchens. This is on the ground floor, and to the right there is the terrace, but it's for not only residents and occupants of the Living Village, but maybe Divinity students who live off campus can use this kitchen to cook together and make a meal. Next slide. This was a rendering we did of the courtyard, imagining different programs that could happen within the courtyard. So a farmer's market or potentially a flea market. There's a kind of green space and then some paved spaces around that. Next slide. So this is, we have furniture that can move out. There's a large set of doors on that kind of community kitchen, so the eating can move to the outside. Next slide. This is a view, as you know, you're kind of coming up Jose's landscape that he was talking about. So this is the large portal entrance. We sort of oversized it to kind of talk about gateway and moving in. That was the community room above that we call the lantern. And next slide, I think we're, and lastly, this is kind of the view as you come through the second portal and you look back out over East Rock, over the landscape. And we've got the kind of series of smaller little community gardens that happen on that terrace. And I think then the next slide is really where we are today. As Jason said, I'll let you, but yes, it is well under construction. So we are in the kind of thick of it at this point.
Yeah, I think, and just to, you know, one thought, one final comment that, you know, thinking about how you view from buildings to buildings and from landscape to other spaces. I think that was a big part of identifying views and also creating spaces that have a sense of security and safety with them, that no matter where you are, if you're one person or many people, that you're in a place that you can kind of visibly see where you're going. You can see people coming. And that's a big part of thinking through landscape as it weaves through the buildings, as it weaves through this campus, and coming up with concepts and ideas that reinforce chance encounters, as Gretchen mentioned. But we're really glad that you invited us to come by today, and we're happy to have your discussions. And thank you so much. That's what we can shift to discussion and questions now. Thank you.
All right, terrific. Thanks, Jason, Gretchen, and Jose. Folks who are participating, most of you are muted. If you want to ask a question, you can hit the raise hand button and I'll recognize you. Or if past this prologue, you can unmute yourself and just jump right in. But I'll start maybe with a couple of questions that occurred to me during this. One, that corridor, the single loaded corridor decision that you were talking about, I think, Gretchen, that you made. So is the passive solar, that's a classic passive solar strategy, right? It's your
It is
mainly south, southeast, and southwest facing, right?
Yes.
So is the material in the materials in the corridor and the floors and the walls of the rooms, is that going to be designed to take advantage of the passive solar, or let's say constructed, I guess, more material choice about that?
So you're absolutely right that the single loaded corridor is a kind of more where you are, your neck of the woods in Texas there. The materials so we are using all triple glazing along that glass facade. So that certainly helps with the kind of solar. And then as I showed the louvers in front of that allow you to look out, but help to kind of mitigate the solar glare. On the opposite side in the rooms, I mean, the entire project is using a very simple set of construction. So we do have cross-laminated timber, so CLT floor slabs, and then we use just really wood construction for there's some shear walls, but it's 2x6s with plywood on either side. We have some LVL, so there's a wood kind of structure in there that you can see there, the columns, and the bedrooms themselves have wood. There's a wood flooring in there. So I think the materials help to kind of soften some of the potential glass glazing on that side. I'm not sure I quite answered your question, Dean.
No, that's okay.
I think Gretchen, you're right on. Like, I think also, Dean, for high performance envelopes, the solar, the passive solar considerations is a little different, where we want to make sure that we shield the highest, sort of, for buildings like this in New England, you run into a condition where you could actually need to bring cooling into buildings in the winter.
Yeah.
because they do get really warm with that low sun. So this isn't a way to balance that. So I would say we're not, and I think to your point, Gretchen, because we're using wood, we're not looking at mass storage as much as
That's what I was asking. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not using a mass storage system as much because we think that, number one, the ambient temperature of timber and wood and these materials will be pretty high. So it's not cold materials like steel or stone inside the building. So that will also help with comfort. But with the high performance, we are doing a lot to manage, and it's all mechanically ventilated. So we're trying, there's an opportunity that if you can balance those shoulder months, like you'll basically just need to ventilate the spaces and you'll have free cooling and free heating for those months. It'll be mechanically done. But then in the winter months, we're basically trying to make sure we don't have to kick on the cooling system because you can get over. So what this does is just balances that, but it's a great question.
And what you haven't seen, we didn't show, it'll be in our next presentation, is the outer walls. Like right now, I always call these the kind of inner courtyard walls, but the bedroom walls, we do a 2-stud construction. So we have a it's basically an 18-inch thick wall where we are filling it with a recycled insulation. So we kind of reduce our carbon footprint by using the recycled, plus we have a super tight insulated exterior envelope that helps with that kind of heat loss or cooling loads that we would need.
Gotcha. Okay. Got Kathy has her hand raised. You next, Kathy, after Paolo Campos from Patricon. Do you want me to read this, Paolo, or do you just want to jump in and unmute yourself and ask the question?
I'm happy to jump in.
Perfect.
Thank you, Dean. Awesome presentation, guys. Really beautiful project. Can't wait to see it. I hope there are opportunities for tours of the site, not just for organizations like this, but I know Yale architecture students and Yale School of the Environment students would really benefit from something like this. As I said in the chat, I'm a nerd for this kind of stuff. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what were some of the optimizations made during the design process for embodied carbon in the design, if any, beyond the mass timber. And then if you can talk a little bit about the materials pedal as it relates to the Living Building Challenge, because that's been a huge impact on our practice at Patricon, but I know is also an ongoing challenge with the red list and the evolution of it and just things inside and outside. And then throw the overlay of it being Yale and institutional on top of that. So navigating the facilities side of things.
Jason, do you want to talk about embodied carbon first? And then I would be happy to talk about the materials list and how we did that.
Yeah, sure. And I think
right in the thick of it.
I want Jose to get in on the carbon too. But from the building standpoint, it's a great question, Paolo. So we went after the big systems first, right? So let's build the building out of wood. Let's use materials that may have, if they do have a high carbon in their manufacture, let's make sure that they have a long life. So I think, through using terracotta cladding locally, manufactured in New York through Boston Valley, and using mass timber that is also, coming together and, using low carbon systems. And as Gretchen mentioned, using a non-thermal plastic exterior wall envelope is a huge contributor to keeping the building light in terms of carbon. So when we're looking at those systems, this is a system that we've tested on a few other buildings, and we've been successful with creating high performance envelopes without thermal plastics. And I think that was probably the biggest step. And then where we did have to spend more of our carbon budget, we made sure that it was equally tied to performance, like triple glazing. This is not a building that can utilize or would be in the budget for vacuum insulated glazing, and double glazing would have had significant impacts on its building energy use. So managing those systems was really the critical part. But I think, Jose, we've been talking about the foundation and concrete for months, and also there's a carbon story with the site. And I think, Jose, why don't you, I think that's it's an exciting topic because we're balancing building, but we also have a site carbon balance that we have to manage too.
Yeah, I think that what we know is that, that 8% or thereabout of emissions are directly connected to production of cement, which is main ingredient for concrete. So we've made an effort to actually reduce the amount of cement content on the mixes by increasing as much as 50%, the cement substitutes. And when we know that there are systems right now that can probably offer something closer to 60 or 70%, but they are not readily available and they were not an option for us to work in here. So we're using more fly ash and slag and things of that nature for the materials. We're also looking at right sizing the footings. And also all the exterior walls are going to be veneer stone for durability, and they have to have a stem wall of concrete. We're trying to reduce the amount of concrete after it's been designed, and as we go through shop drawings, trying to minimize the volume of concrete, because the greenest cubic yard of concrete is the one that is not poor. We know that. But the other component of this is that, we have in the landscape the capacity to sequester carbon through photosynthesis. Now, I have to say that, as a landscape architect, it's something that we're looking at it very carefully. It's something that is really no more elegant way to sequester carbon than using plants, but it's not the solution. It's not really, we're not going to get ourselves out of the hole planting trees because essentially, it's very difficult with the longevity of the trees to actually come up with a plant that is going to be carbon neutral, believe it or not. So preserving trees and, making sure that we don't lose that was very important on the site. In some cases, we could not afford to replace them, but we're tripling the amount of trees that were there on the site originally. We're looking also soil systems that are manufactured, so they're not using topsoil and things of that nature, but that are focused on performance, trying to bring in the greatest amount of carbon sequestration possible by root systems in the landscape, and also amending the soils and modifying the soils. We're looking at the possibility of incorporating biochar, which is a very stable way to actually bring, carbon into the soil. So all these things, I think, are part of the carbon equation, as well as the effort to reuse water on the site and limit the consumption of water, which I think is very important. So, we also looked at stone that has a lower embedded carbon, depending how do you spec it, than concrete. Looking at mixes for concrete, which we had to use for some elements of the site, again, with a very low carbon footprint, and looking at materials that are sourced locally to make sure that, this is about the place and ultimately affects the communities and the local economy. So all of that, was very much part and parcel of the process of making the material selection on the landscape. Solar lights, for instance, yeah.
The only thing I was going to say about the carbon as well is we worked with, Jason showed you that we really do have a lot of consultants that have helped on this project. There's a lot of experts. And so New Frameworks we worked with them. They are a consultant with carbon counting and helping us. So, with our Revit model, we were able to use the plugin of Tally kind of throughout the design process to see what our carbon count was, and then working with New Frameworks to where we could tweak things and kind of always checking to see where we were just with the materials that we were starting to add. Likewise, I think with the material red list free, that is a big part of LBC, and it is an ongoing, we meet weekly now during CDs with our construction manager. Shawmut Construction is doing this with us. They were part of pre-construction services. And so we worked with a consultant, IES, their integrated,
integrated eco strategy.
Yes, that's it. And we worked with them all through design to really, as much as we could, had a kind of pre-vetted specifications. So they have a software that allowed us to, make sure that materials we chose had a declare label. And so that helped kind of a starting point that we were, starting with things that we knew would work. But we meet weekly to talk about materials and kind of make value decisions of cost is certainly a part of it, Yale standards, and where do we alter from that and do what is right with the LBC requirements versus kind of standards. And so we talk about it weekly in terms of our material list.
And I'll put a plug into for April 2nd, we're going to have another follow-up webinar. We're doing this through the resource committee at the International Living Future Institute. And we're actually going to have the CM on board who will also talk about, because a lot of times, as Gretchen just said, we do our work. IES is actually working on both sides of the table. So they're working also with our CM, Shamit. They've worked with us for over years working on this project. So that continuity, that's another part of, that'll be coming in April. So please, we can send this group the login. I think you guys can get in and participate and listen to that as well.
Where were you a few months ago? Thank you for posting that link to Positive. That is fantastic. We'll see if we can get it into the pipeline right now. Because I would say on the question of carbon, I mean, you have an opportunity still in the submittals and then the shop drawings review to actually be more efficient with the use of cementitious materials. So this is great. Thank you so much.
It's relatively new, I will say. It's only come online the last year and a half. Right now, only one concrete supplier in Connecticut is really offering it. But groups like this, and designers and engineers that join in, the more that they know about it, the more we can spread the word and hopefully see more broad adoption of it. So I have many other questions, but I defer to others. So I don't want to monopolize things. But thank you, guys. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paolo. Kathy Jorgen, you had a question or you had your hand raised?
Yeah, I have questions, comments, and I'm looking forward to that next webinar because, like Paolo, I have a lot that I want to learn from this. This is a fantastic project and so well presented and so interesting. My main question is, you have a group of people who clearly were committed to begin with to a high level of achievement, both socially and environmentally. Can you talk a little bit about how participating with the Living Futures Institute changed what you're thinking? And I'm particularly interested in this because I've just joined the affordable housing demonstration. So look forward to learning from you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think also it starts and, when we think about projects this is a lot of what no one's done this before, right? So I think even in affordable housing, when we think about how do we begin to populate the same, ideas, philosophy, and vision to affordable housing, that's sort of where we really get excited about. We're doing testing here. We're getting it to a place where it can be proven, and then we're moving that into more markets. I think it started with, it's just, and Jose, I think this is actually where, Jose had been working on projects that had gone through, and I'll say, Jose was coming off of the Phipps Conservatory project expansion building that was done several years ago. And, sort of thinking about those philosophies. So it was about 10 years ago, maybe even 15 now, where we started connecting once a year. We were on a resource committee that met monthly. But that's where we started to really unpack culturally, how could we achieve this, or how could we approach this from a firm's perspective? How could me and my partners figure out how to test this, even though we hadn't done it before. Before this project, we worked on a smaller project up at Hampshire College called the Kern Center. And that's where we kind of cut our teeth on a lot of these discussions in the Northeast. Relatively in the Northeast, it was quite different because there wasn't a lot of large projects that were being done at that time. And we were, with Jose, some of the first commercial projects to come out and trying to achieve the Living Building Challenge. So I think the idea is it's one that I think getting into that network and starting to meet the folks that have gone before us, and also what we learned. I learned so much from teams that were struggling and grappling with things that we hadn't really encountered yet. And part of the continuum is, why we go back and share with groups like yourself so that we can share what we've learned. So I do think that's, it's not a real hard answer, but I think it's once you make the decision to want to bring these initiatives to the two projects that you're working on, I think then it's we spend a lot of time hanging out with folks that have done it. And then also now we're finding ourselves that we're spending time with folks that are trying to do it. And I think that that's a wonderful way to continue to elevate all, the tide raises all boats. And, I've learned so much from Jose because they were coming off of projects years before we had attempted it. And, as Gretchen and the team that we have, we're folding the knowledge that we learned in projects past and to the team that we have today. So once you start doing this work, you begin to see a little bit further into what you need from the team expertise. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it didn't happen overnight, and it's something that we continue to work on and build.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
One thing that I can say after many years trying to do this is that let's not forget that, the people that actually make projects happen, people that implement the projects, the contractors, the construction managers, they play such a significant role in this. They are an integral part of this way of systems thinking. And without them, cannot happen. So pre-construction services, I think, are absolutely necessary. Perhaps, we were commenting this, maybe some of these projects align with IPD and integrated delivery, project delivery. I think it's a whole new way to look at this. But we are as a practice also of the opinion that with the high rise or with the high tide, all boats rise, and we can make a difference, and elevate, the understanding from everybody by doing these kinds of meetings and by trying to do it different, in every project.
Yeah, terrific. That's in principle, you guys have outlined what we were set up to do 5 years ago as a innovations network and bringing together conversations like this. So yeah, you're reaffirming what we're doing, which is a good thing. Lindsay, I'm sorry.
Important, absolutely, critical for all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, speaking with Lindsay Suter, did you want to just say what you said in the chat about positive? And you're.
Oh, if you like, yeah. My 15 minutes of fame. I've been working with the folks up at Positive for a long time, and I had to replace, the stars aligned. I had to replace my carport, and was trying to get my, I always experiment on myself, my poor family, before I ask others to do it. And so we had Tilcon's first job with the Pozzolan here, and it was a 50% drop match for the Portland cement. And it turned out beautifully. It was hysterical because I have a tiny little place, and there were probably 15 people there observing it, and only 2 guys actually pouring the slab.
That's great.
But it's very light. It's got a high albedo. It's really tough stuff, and so far it's gorgeous.
That's great.
That's nice
cool.
work. Nice work.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a topic for one of our upcoming meetings, but we could discuss that later. But positive sounds like an interesting thing to talk about.
My place is yours.
So we're nearing the end of time. Any final questions from anybody in the participant list? I had one quick one for whoever. When you first presented the cistern discussion, Jose, and the roof capture of you're at the peak, you're getting literally at the peak and picking up all this water. I was thinking, okay, then how did you handle energy? And then it turns out that the roof also generates energy through PV. Was there any complication in the detailing for that to make sure that you could get the maximal water and the maximal energy from your PV arrays. If I understand correctly, they are across all the roofs, right?
Yeah.
The PV. So how do those two things relate? I mean,
Oh,
is there any
I-
problem with capturing the water? Is there something special you have to do?
Not that I know, other than a complicated gutter detail.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
and I would say it's a little TBD because we're, the one thing I would say about our solar just is, we have an integrated solar tile, so it's not like
okay.
not a, a metal roof with solar sitting on top. We are using a product that is the roof itself.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
So-
Those are.
Yeah.
Well,
those
no,
are-
and, to your point, it does meet the the potable water. So there are there's a select group of materials that you can use for water collection, and because we have to think about every single material that water comes in touch with before it goes in the cistern. So this was a way for us to balance the architectural impacts of solar design, because I think solar design is at a phase or a stage of production and technology that is going to continue to change. And I think this is a product that is one of those developments where they're basically, they're aligning a roof system with solar generation, and it's not the Tesla tile, but it's not the Google tile. It's this other product that we're looking at for the metal roof. So they are closely integrated, Dean, because anytime you're collecting water, now we're not collecting it for potable use in this case, but I have worked on projects where we did do that, and it becomes a very intricate discussion about solving the details. And as Jose would say, it's like, well, what's the quality of the water, and can we catch it earlier so that we can keep the quality higher? If you can do that, you spend a lot less money and resources and equipment filtering out the contaminants.
Yeah.
Dean,
Terrific.
we did a project for an LDC project for Georgia Tech, the Candida building, and that has an array, a more traditional array of photovoltaic panels. And I remember, very early on the discussions about the structure and the capturing of the water and keeping it clean, and the gutter system was integral to that conversation. So, it's a little different, but if you know that you're doing it from the beginning, I think that it's absolutely achievable.
It takes me back a while to high performance schools work that I was doing in the early 2000s, and a lot of people were talking about cisterns in schools, new school, even actually re-roofs, and it was an interesting process. It's come a long way, particularly when you start marrying the two together, energy and water. It's a nice cycle.
I think that the connection of water and energy is not clearly understood.
Yeah.
And
Well, we'll get micro turbines up there with the water coming off the roof, and that'll take the place. We'll supplement the PV. Anyway, I think we're basically past the time bell. So I'd really like to thank Jason and Gretchen and Jose for really, everybody obviously thought it was a really terrific presentation. Remind everybody in the group that we have these once a month. You'll be getting a notification when this particular presentation is on our archive, as will you guys, our speakers, and an announcement about our next session. So as we close out, I just wanted to make one slightly tongue-in-cheek suggestion that when you go, since this is a divinity school, I would try to carve out a special space with the Living Building Future, or Living Future Institute, for an after living building challenge winner, because of the sacred nature of the site that you're going in and what they study there. So anyway, that was a bit of a reach, but I'll stop there. I'll stop while I'm behind. and thank you all once again for coming. Really, really terrific project. We'll keep an eye on it. I get up to New Haven often. I'll keep checking it out.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Until
Thank
next
you,
month.
everyone. It was wonderful. Thanks
Thank
so
you. Good
much.
luck
Thank you
on
so
the
much.
project.
Appreciate everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Good. Bye-bye.
Bye.